Hjertelig velkommen til Filadelfiakirken denne kvelden her. På vegne av laget og Filadelfiakirken så ønsker jeg, Andreas Hegertun, jeg er en av pastorene her i kirken, deg velkommen. Som kirke så er en av hensiktene grunnen til at vi finnes er tilbedelse av Gud. Og en del av tilbedelse er å søke sannhet og lære. Og derfor er vi veldig glad for, og mange med meg tror jeg har gledet oss til akkurat denne kvelden her, på grunn av besøket vi har her. Og jeg skal straks gi ordet over til de, men la oss samle oss et lite øyeblikk i en bønn først. Far i himmelen, du som har skapt oss, gitt oss livet og muligheten til at vi er akkurat her, akkurat nå. Nå legger vi denne kvelden i dine hender, og så ber vi om å få lære, forstå og vokse til likhet med deg, Jesus Kristus. Amen. Da er det en stor glede å få overlate scenen her til kommunikasjonsleder i laget Daniel Joachim Kleiven, og ikke minst historiker og forfatter Tom Holland. Vær så god, vi ønsker deg velkommen.
Velkommen hit. Dette kommer til å bli litt sånn der samtale- og spørsmålkveld, så vi ønsker at det skal være mye tid til spørsmålene deres. For det er ikke noe grunn til at bare jeg skal sitte her og stille masse spørsmål, men det er mye klokt som er på hjertet til denne mannen, og det ønsker vi å få ut her til dere. Så vi kommer nok til å prate litt sånn her 30 minutter først om kveldens tema, og så kommer vi etter hvert til å måtte åpne gulvet for dere. Og da kommer det til å bli sendt rundt en mikrofon, så da er det bare å rekke en hånd i været, og så får dere ordet, og så stiller vi spørsmål. Yes, are you ready?
Absolutely.
Should we do this?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're the writer of many books, all from fiction about vampires to big history about the great civilizations from Persia, the Greeks, the Romans, and everything. And you're also the co-host of a very popular podcast called The Rest is History, which is just about all things history. You talk about the Aztecs and the French civilization and Hitler. And you also do a World Cup of Gods where people can vote on who's their favorite god. And the top 10 mistresses and eunuchs of history.
Yes.
So it's varied and it's very entertaining. But the reason you're here is that your latest book is called Dominion. And it's sort of a big history for 600 pages where you sort of just sketch where do our ideas come from? Where do all of our hidden assumptions, things that we just take for granted in our everyday life, where do all they come from? And your answer is basically that it is Christianity that sort of permeates all of the ideas, our goals, even our terminology. That it's kind of hard to speak, being a person who has grown up in the Western culture, without sort of using some Christian assumptions.
Yes, absolutely. The idea is, and I apologize that I have to speak in English. I apologize for my lack of Norwegian. The idea is that everyone in the West pretty much is swimming like goldfish in a bowl, and the water that we swim in is Christian. And that was the metaphor that I had as I wrote the book. But then when I finished the book, I watched a drama series about Chernobyl. I don't know if it's been shown on Norwegian TV, but it was about the catastrophe with the nuclear reactor. And there was a scene in that where two of the characters were right up close to the reactor, and it had split, and you could see the radioactivity leaking because it was ionizing the air. So right up close you could see exactly what was happening. But of course the impact of the radiation leak was that radioactivity then spread over the forests of Ukraine towards Kiev, northwards up to where we are now. And people breathed it in, they were changed, they were affected by it, even though they couldn't see it, even though they might not recognize what was happening, that something had changed in the air. And I think that the impact of Christianity, not just on Europe but on the world, is kind of like that. That, of course, we can recognize the way that Christianity, in the form of churches and Bibles and priests and popes and so on, has changed and affected the course of Western history. But I think that its influence is much, much profounder than that, and that it has changed us and continues to change us in ways that I think lots of people who would say, I'm not Christian, lots of people who would say, I'm very hostile to Christianity, I'm very hostile to religion. Nevertheless, their assumptions are so steeped in the legacy of 2,000 years of Christianity that they are, to all intents and purposes, absolutely saturated with Christian assumptions.
So I also have to admit that, well, of course, being a Christian, we sort of have a hidden agenda by inviting here. And all Christians have hidden agendas, unlike others, so that's why I shouldn't trust it. But that's kind of many of us might feel that we're being pushed out to the boundaries of society, we're becoming irrelevant, we're becoming old-fashioned. But there's a kind of sense that our message is at the core of society, and it's sort of underlying, and it's soaking up all the ideas that are public discussions that we watch on television and then we watch everywhere. It's sort of soaked in.
I think that is absolutely true, and I think that one of the problems that institutional or doctrinal Christianity faces in the West is that its victory has been so total. Assumptions that in the context of the world into which Christianity was born seemed breathtakingly radical and strange and bizarre are now completely taken for granted. And they're taken so completely for granted that people in the West just assume it's human nature. So the pandemic has obviously focused attention on healthcare and the way in which states in Europe supply healthcare. And it's seen as being absolutely central and fundamental responsibility. But the idea that the sick should be cared for on a kind of mass scale is a completely Christian one. Indeed, when in the 3rd century, when the Roman Empire was swept by a series of terrible plagues, it was the readiness of Christians to care for the sick, and not just Christians who'd fallen sick, but everybody. That, lots of Christians, of course, then felt terribly ill and died themselves. But the spectacle of it was a huge contributory factor in the growth of Christianity over the course of the 3rd century, and therefore, of course, had an impact on the ultimate conversion of the Roman Empire. And when, in the 4th century, it became evident to the ruling classes that Christianity basically was here to stay, that it had seized the commanding heights of the elite in the Roman Empire, people with the money to show off and to splash stopped investing it in amphitheaters or triumphal arches or all the kind of stuff that they had traditionally done, and started investing it in things like orphanages and care for widows and in hospitals. And it's in the 4th century that you start for the first time to get hospitals caring for the vast mass of people. And that is a tradition that then feeds through the Middle Ages in Europe and is with us today. And it's absolutely taken for granted over most of Christian history that this is something that derives from, it's Christians who supply the medical care. In the 20th century, that responsibility across Europe has been nationalized. And I don't know what it's like in Norway, but certainly in England, you are forbidden to proselytize. The dimension of the spiritual, of the religious has been completely banished from hospitals. But the existence of, there would be no tradition of public healthcare like that without this legacy of healthcare that derives from Christianity. And that's a kind of obvious example, I think.
Yeah, so let's get back to the present. But I thought we could start at the very beginning, because you write about the big cultures that people like to look up to, and you study them. And in the beginning of Dominion, you sort of do this thought experiment. Then imagine just walking around looking at people crucified without sort of that Christian assumption. Because being crucified was, of course, for the lowest of the low. That was slaves, that was criminals. And it was a very public executions for others to see and to be frightened.
Well, so the book opens with a description of crucifixion, of what it meant, what it was to be crucified. And I did not initially begin the book with that, but I'd written about 3 chapters, and then I was talking about this to you a minute ago, I went to northern Iraq to make a film about the Islamic State and the impact it had had on Christians and Yazidis, a religious minority in northern Iraq. And this was in 2016, so Islamic State was still very much a presence in northern Iraq. And we went to a town called Sinjar, which had been occupied by the Islamic State and had been a home to the Yazidis. There are about 250, 300,000 of them. And they are seen by radical Muslims as not just pagans, but as devil worshippers, which is an absolute, is not true at all, but they are, in the opinion of the Islamic State, they deserved to be essentially wiped out. And so notoriously, the women and the girls, many as young as 8, were rounded up, enslaved, taken away, used in every conceivable way, so unspeakable treatment. But the men were slaughtered, and many of them were crucified. And when I went to Sinjar, the Islamic State had been pushed out by the Kurds about a few weeks before, but they were camped out about a mile or so across flat land. And it was terrifying. I mean, I'm not a brave person, and I hadn't intended to go anywhere near Islamic State. So I was very scared at the thought of being captured and being beheaded on YouTube or whatever. But when I got back, I realized that actually the real horror had been being in a town and knowing that there were people within striking distance, within mortar distance, who viewed crucifixion as the Romans had viewed crucifixion. In other words, the cross to the Islamic State had nothing of the significance that it has for us, even in the most secularized West. If you're lying, you've been knocked over and a van comes up and it's got a cross on the side, you don't have to be a Christian to know that this is good news. The cross, for most people, subliminally, it's a good thing. But for Islamic State, it was served as it had served the Romans, as an emblem of their absolute power. And I came back and I remembered the kind of sense of dread that thinking that had filled me with. I had experienced crucifixion as someone in the Roman world had experienced it, as something that kind of knotted the stomach up with dread and fear. And for the Romans, the cross was an emblem of their authority and their power to torture to death anyone who opposed them. And there were 2 particular categories. One of them, of course, is people in the provinces who think to resist Roman authority. But more fundamentally than that, crucifixion is seen by the Romans as the punishment to be inflicted on rebellious or uppity slaves. And crucifixion is seen as being the essential form of execution for a slave, not just because it is agonizing, not just because it is protracted, because it lasts for hours and for days, but because it is public and therefore humiliating and shaming. So when you are nailed to a cross or strapped to a cross or bound to a cross, your suffering is public. People will gather and laugh as birds peck out your eyes or attack your genitals, or as you heave yourself up and down, struggling to get breath in your lungs. And when you finally die, there you will hang, a kind of bleeding hunk of meat, food for birds, and your twisted, suffering body will act as an advertisement advertising Roman power. That's what crucifixion was. And it brought home to me, I'd understood it intellectually, but I didn't really understand it viscerally in my gut until I'd been to Sinjar and stood in a place where the same thing had happened. It brought home to me the utter strangeness of the cross. That's what is most unsettling and bizarre about the message of Christianity. Paul says, everybody, all the earliest Christian writers, it's strange and it's embarrassing and it's unsettling. And Paul, our earliest witness to this, he is embarrassed by it. He says it's a stumbling block to the Jews. It's a thing of it seems ridiculous to everyone else, to the Gentiles, to the Romans. And this sense of embarrassment about it kind of lingers throughout the early Christian centuries, to the degree that even in the 4th century, when Constantine has converted and the empire is becoming Christian, people still can't bring themselves to illustrate it. So there are illustrations of the crucifixion, but they're done by necromancers trying to invoke its power, or by people who are mocking Christianity. But the earliest portrayals of Christianity, of the cross, of the crucifixion, are not really until the beginning of the 5th century. And there is an ivory that dates to the beginning of the 5th century that finally shows Jesus on the cross, but he's portrayed as a kind of athlete. He's like an athlete in the Olympics. He's kind of muscular and ripped and, like a massive hunk. And he's just kind of lying there and he's got the loincloth of an athlete on. And he doesn't look like a man who is suffering hideous pain. And it's another 600 years before finally we get a portrayal of Christ dead on the cross. And that's a cross in Cologne Cathedral, dated to around the year 1000. And then over the course of the Middle Ages, you increasingly people start to focus on the agony and the suffering of Christ on the cross, and it becomes a subject of kind of profound meditation for medieval Christians. And I think that one of the effects of that is simply, in the long run, to desensitize Christians, actually, to the horror. So it goes from embarrassment to acceptance of the horror to kind of desensitization. And I think that essentially, we see the cross now, and we tend to think of it perhaps as a symbol of Christianity, but we don't tend to see exactly what it is about it that's so incredibly strange.
Yeah. So from kind of being a symbol of embarrassment to becoming a symbol of pride or even love for many people, all because of that it occurred to one person. But what was so special about this person? Because there were 2,000 years ago, there were lots of doomsday prophets and people claiming divinity. So what was so special about?
Well, there are people being crucified all the time in the Roman world, and shortly after the death of Jesus, the Romans attack and destroy Jerusalem. And by the time they finally capture Jerusalem, the hills around the city have been absolutely stripped bare because they've all been chopped down to make crosses. So the Jewish defenders on the walls of Jerusalem are looking out, and there is a forest with people writhing and dying in front of them. So there are multiple people being crucified all the time. It's in your face. What's special about this one person? Well, what's special about this one person is clearly that his followers think that he has risen from the dead, and that what is special about the crucifixion is that it is followed by resurrection. And the question of why they think that is beyond my pay grade as a historian, but it is evident from the earliest text we have, namely Paul's letters, that this is what they thought. And I think that Paul is a particularly compelling witness, because even if we don't trust the Acts of the Apostles, which is written several decades after Paul, to be an accurate account of what he saw, we know from his own testimony that he had a vision of the risen Christ. And we know that he had persecuted the church before that. And so we know that it is a profoundly unsettling and unexpected vision for him to have. And it's clear from his letters that they are an exercise in trying to work out basically what's going on. You know, who is Jesus? Why has he had this vision? How does this relate to the great legacy of Hebrew scripture? And Paul's letters, of course, are not statements of doctrine. They are, in a sense, kind of dramatic monologues in which this man is trying to make sense of something so strange that, as I said, he kind of feels embarrassed about it. And his answer is that clearly derives from his reading of the Hebrew scriptures. You know, he's been raised in one understanding of the Hebrew scriptures, and now he's had this vision, and he goes back and he looks at them in the awareness of this vision, and he kind of finds the message written there that he hadn't properly appreciated. And this message, as he understands it, is that Jesus, who suffered death on a cross, in some strange way that Paul doesn't seem entirely sure about, is in some way a part of the one creator God. And that, of course, is the stumbling block for the Jews, because how could a man be playing that part? So Paul entirely understands that. But it's also, you know, ridiculous to the Romans. And it's ridiculous to the Romans not because a man has become a god, because the Romans entirely accept that. The fastest growing cult in the time of lifetime of Jesus is the cult of Augustus Caesar. And Augustus is the son of a god. His title, his name is Divi Filius, son of a god, because he's the son of the deified Julius Caesar, the adopted son. And Augustus and his followers, they have euangelion, they have good news to proclaim. And this good news is that the world had been ravaged by chaos and disaster, and a man has been born, heralded by extraordinary signs. These signs, were, according to Suetonius, were so extraordinary that the Senate was unsettled by it and vowed to slaughter all the babies that had been born in that year and were only averted at the last moment. So a kind of eerie echo of the massacre of the innocents. And Augustus had against all the odds, he had brought peace to a terrified world. And at the end of his life, he had risen up into the heavens, and he was sat at the right hand of his Father. And this is a message that was proclaimed in temples across the Roman Empire, and it seems to have been particularly picked up in Galatia. Paul, going to Galatia, writing to the Galatians, knows that there are all these temples to Augustus, that there are great kind of friezes where Augustus gives, he proclaims this euangelion, this good news everywhere, that this son of a god has ascended into heaven, but looks down and will continue to provide a reign of peace over the entire world. And Paul, in his letters, describing what has happened with this crucified slave, this is a massive exercise in blasphemy, not just for the Jews, but for the Romans. It's a grotesque parody of what the Romans believe about Augustus. And what is grotesque about it is that Augustus ruled the world. He's a great emperor. Imperator means a conquering, a victorious general. Jesus was not. Jesus told Peter to put his sword up. Jesus was arrested. Jesus suffered the most humiliating death imaginable. And that is the depth of the weirdness and the strangeness. And the problem for us now is that as a society, we are absolutely conditioned to believe that it's better to suffer than to inflict suffering. We're conditioned to accept the moral power of being a victim. I mean, everything, Black Lives Matter, and gay rights, or none of this would make sense without that foundational assumption. But in the context of the world into which Christianity is born, it is, as Paul says, absolutely mad.
Yeah. So you're saying if you go to a Roman officer and say that you're a victim, how would he respond?
Ha ha ha.
Yeah.
Yeah, kick sand in your face.
So you're trying to get us back to the present, and I'm trying to get us back to the past. So, but what is it about this event that would sort of to breed a culture that could give rise to all this kind of different kind of moral behavior, that people will build hospitals, try to end slavery, develop methods of natural science and human rights and everything?
So why does Christianity flourish in the Roman world?
Yeah, in one sense, what is it about this event that starts a chain reaction to the world as we know it today?
Well, okay, so the historian's answer. So if you're a kind of Darwinian, you know, survival of the fittest. Christianity is clearly the fittest. Why does it survive? Why does it flourish? It obviously has something about it that makes it spread and succeed in this kind of astonishing way. I think that it offers something for the powerful. Why does Constantine embrace Christianity? He's been auditioning a number of gods to play the role of essentially a kind of monotheistic role, because Constantine is an unbelievably vain man. He wants to rule the entire world, and he doesn't want a whole bunch of different gods. He wants a single god, a single god for a single empire. So he's been auditioning the sun, he's been auditioning Heracles, he's been auditioning Apollo, and in the end it's Jesus who passed the audition, by a vision of the cross. So I think that is a crucial part of it. But I think the fundamental reason is that Christianity gives to people who had not previously had dignity. And it does this by drawing on the legacy of Hebrew scriptures, Genesis, by casting humans as being fashioned in the image of God, gives them a kind of incredible dignity. So there are echoes of the story of Genesis in Babylonian mythology, where the gods are slaving for the king of the gods, and they're fed up with this, and so they make humans to serve as the slaves for the gods. That's essentially how humans are seen. Genesis gives them a very different order of dignity. But then, of course, with the Paul's teaching that the first covenant, which was between Moses and between God and the children of Israel, has now been joined by a second covenant that is for everyone, and that in this second covenant there is no Jew or Greek, there is no man or woman, there is no slave or free. The implications of that are incredibly radical, and when you fuse that in with the idea that Jesus suffered the death of a slave, and so therefore perhaps in a sense God is closer to the victim, to the suffering, to the poor, to the tortured, to the servile, to the abused, than he is to the powerful. That offers, in a world that is kind of brutal and hierarchical, I think beyond our worst nightmares, an incredible sense of hope. And it's expressed in practical terms through the help that is given to those who are sick, for instance. We touched on that. To orphans, to widows, to people in prison. I don't think you have to look too hard to see why the idea that God loved the world as profoundly as he did, i.e. suffered what he did, and that he did it for you, scullery maid who's being raped by your owner every day. Did it for you, abandoned child thrown on a slag heap that's going to be, bought by a pimp. Did it for you, slave with your feet chopped off so that you can't run away as you labor in the mine. I mean, you can see what the power of it is.
But if we sort of fast forward, then this probably wouldn't be good news to everyone, and this might surprise, and this message might even surprise many of us, because in one sense our society is sort of founded on the assumption that all human beings are of equal value. Being a king doesn't give you any additional value, and at the same time you have sort of this modern secular narrative that's behind. That's sort of defining our lives as persons in the modern West. And that secular sort of creation myth goes something like this, that, well, we came from somewhere, there was sort of aspirations for reason and science back with the Greeks and the Romans. But of course then Christianity and superstition comes and ruins everything and just pushes the world into the Dark Ages. Until the Renaissance and the Enlightenment come and people start using reason to find their values, and we develop science to find out that we don't need to rely on gods and myths to explain the world. And yeah, so that's sort of our savior, and it's pointing towards a heaven where religion and superstition is no more, and every tear is dried.
Well, there's so much to unpick there.
Can I read you a quote?
Yeah.
Because in Lage, one of the projects that we do is that we investigate Norwegian school books that hundreds of thousands of youths is supposed to learn from. And we found some quite horrendous quotes in some of them. Many of them are good, but in some of them. So I just wanted to read you actually a quote from one of these textbooks. And this is called Intertext, and I've translated it briefly for you because you said that your Norwegian skills are still quite basic.
Tack.
So in this book it says, let's quickly have a look at the past. Imagine a society where religion, through the church, claims to explain all matters of society and nature. The population is not allowed to believe anything that the religion hasn't first approved of. This is a system where thought is not free, but free thought is perceived as dangerous because it threatens the institutions of power. In this kind of society, there are no forces that encourage science to find new and surprising knowledge, but quite the contrary. New knowledge is received with skepticism. Here, the human being is small, while God is large. This society is the Middle Ages of Europe. And then it continues to say that, well, gradually there grows a thought that the world was governed by natural laws and not divine powers. And then, of course, you have the heroes, that without fear, Voltaire criticizes the society he is a part of, and especially the church and religion. He was also a champion of natural law ethics, or human rights, as we would call them today. That is, in principle, that there is some basic rights for human beings given to us by nature. So not from above, but from
I don't know where to begin with that. I mean, as I say, there is so much to unpick there. So first of all, on the idea that there was an age of science where Greeks sat around in sheets, kind of discovering things and putting it all in the Library of Alexandria, and then Christians come and burn it down because they're against science. And if any of that hadn't happened, we'd all be on Alpha Centauri by now, which is a kind of quite, I mean, you said that, in the past people had their myth. People still have their myths, and that's the myth of kind of modern secular atheism. And it's a complete myth because the idea that science and religion have always existed as categories is incredibly anachronistic. The idea of science is a very recent one. It's kind of, certainly in English, it only took on that meaning in the late 19th century. And the idea that there are things called religions that are separate from something called the secular, likewise, is a completely Christian idea, massively rooted in Christian theology. And I think you're an economist. Isn't there something that Keynes said, that every no-nonsense person who believes that he has a kind of common-sense opinion is actually just recycling the views of some superannuated economist or something like that. But I would say that by and large, almost everything that most people today take for granted is simply the reflection of some forgotten theologian. And actually, the theologian in this case isn't forgotten because he's the towering genius of the Latin Church, and it's Augustine. And the idea that we have religion and we have the secular, and that these are somehow separate, basically derives from Augustine. And it follows on from the sack of Rome. I mean, it's kind of amazing that the idea of the secular, we probably wouldn't have it if Rome had not been sacked. And the reason for that is that in the wake of the sack of Rome, all kinds of people who are opposed to Christianity in Rome say, well, oh, look what's happened. We've turned to Christianity, and now Rome is being, invaded by barbarians. So obviously we should have stuck with the old gods. And Augustine turns around and says, no, not at all, because actually Rome is not an eternal city. Rome is mortal because all things of this fallen earth, the city of man, all things are mortal. And the word that he uses is the cyculum, cycularia, things of the cyculum. And the cyculum is essentially the span of human memory. So at most it's 100 years. That's where the French word siècle comes from. And Augustine says, basically, we needn't worry about the sack of Rome and the fact that the Roman Empire may collapse and go, because everything on this mortal earth will go. We are all part of the cyculum. We are like leaves, that drop into a river, and the current carries us away. And that is true of everything. And there is only one thing that can redeem us from this relentless flow of the cyculum. And that is the religio, the bond that joins the church to the eternal radiance of heaven. And in Latin, there were many religiones that bound people to the gods. Could be a sacrifice, could be a priesthood, could be a festival, could be whatever. But Augustine believes there is only one God, so therefore there is only the one religio. And he enshrines for people in the Latin West this idea that there is the dimension of the cyculum, there is the dimension of religio. And then in the 11th century, this provides the framework for what in effect is Europe's first great revolution. Because you get radicals who seize control of the commanding heights of the oldest, the most prestigious bishopric in the Latin West, which is, of course, that of Rome. And they use this power to force through a sense that society has to be divided in two, between the dimension of the cyculum, which is that of earthly kings, earthly monarchs, earthly knights, people with earthly power, who up until this point have laid claim to a kind of stake in the church. Kings and emperors appoint bishops, for instance. And the reformers in the church say this is unacceptable because the church has this religio, has this bond to God. And it should be like a kind of virgin arrayed in blinding white robes. And we can't have kings and emperors with their grubby fingers pawing at the robes of the church. So back off. And it's an incredibly radical understanding of how society should operate. Because everywhere, across the entirety of the world until that point, the assumption had always been that if you're an earthly king, an earthly emperor, then you have a stake in the dimension of the supernatural as well. Absolutely, And the reformers basically contradict that. And the effect of that is to establish the Middle Ages as this incredibly revolutionary society where everything is kind of set on establishing this sense that society is divided into two. And over the course of the Middle Ages, this really beds down. And then it gets another fresh iteration with the Reformation, because the Reformation is just another attempt to bring Europe to a kind of primal sense of purity and responsibility. In the 11th century, the ambition had been to baptize the whole of the Christian people, to cleanse them of their sin. By the 16th century, there are many Christians who feel either that it's gone too far, or more importantly, that it hasn't gone far enough. And essentially what Luther and Calvin and so on are doing is simply a recycling, a reinvigoration of the process that had begun the great cycle of reform in the 11th and 12th century. In the Middle Ages, religio had been a particular responsibility for those who commit their lives to it, so monks, friars, hermits, nuns, and so on. With the Reformation, the assumption is taught that everybody should have a religio, a bond to God. And so therefore a premium is put on belief. What do you as an individual believe? And certainly in English, a Protestant country, this is what religion, so it goes from religio to religion, this is the change. But also religion exists in the context of the cyculum, which becomes the secular. And so religion in English, and I would guess the equivalent in Norwegian, has this dual sense. It's what you as an individual believe, but it's also something that exists as a kind of entity that is separate from an order that is coming to be called the secular. And the idea beds down that there are whole spheres of existence where religion needn't touch. And this then is an assumption that the Protestant powers, of whom Britain is the most obvious one, then export around the world. So when the British go to India and they look around, they call India Hindustan, where Hindus live. Hindus is the word that the British use in the 18th century for Indians. And they say, what is the religion of the Hindus? It's a mad question. Because, Hindus have no idea what a religion is. It's an entirely British, it's a Protestant idea that reflects centuries and centuries of cultural evolution. But they said that, they end up saying, well, there's something called Hinduism and it's a religion, as they say the same about Islam, about Judaism, and they construct this idea that there are things called religions and then there's a space called the secular, and, this is what we all accept now. But it's a completely, to most people, it would be an absolutely mad idea. So I completely forgot what it was that I was getting cross about. So that's an example of how. Okay, yes. So I remember what it was.
The quote.
Yes.
Your angry at Norwegian school books. Remember.
Okay. So we have. So the idea that the secular is somehow a neutral state that has always existed is a myth. It isn't. It's a culturally contingent product of Christianity. But also the idea that we now have freed ourselves. We've emancipated ourselves from superstition. We have toppled the idols that previously were erected. And previously we were in darkness, and now we have brought ourselves into light. This is the idea that essentially the passage you read me kind of is reflecting. And it reminds me that Norway is, of course, a deeply Protestant country, because that's exactly what the Reformation was about. The Reformation was about banishing superstition, toppling idols, bringing people who had walked in darkness into light. But of course, the Protestant Reformation in turn was drawing on the same process that had inspired Christian missionaries to go into the dripping forests of Saxony or, come to the wilds of Norway and, again, topple idols, banish superstition, bring people into light. And even before Christianity, this is what was inspiring the Hebrew prophets. So that language comes from the Hebrew prophets. So that passage you read for me, it's not an emancipation from the influence of the Bible. It's an absolute illustration of how enduring its hold is.
So in some sense, concepts like religion and secular are sort of steeped in Christianity. We just had our elections in Norway. And I remember a discussion a short time ago where we discussed whether religion and politics should mix. And I kind of asked, well, what's the alternative? Like, politics is just ethics in large scale, because it's about questions about what should we promote, or what kind of goods should we pursue. And ethics is sort of trying to define what is a good. And religion is often what we call like the search for what is true and good. So I asked him, well, what's the alternative to sort of mix politics and religion, at least in that sense? Well, he said, well, you can just look to the human rights, because we sort of have this secular, rational foundations for ethics in the Western culture. So religion is basically obsolete. Do you agree?
So human rights. Yes. So what was it said, that human rights is based in nature?
Well, it's sort of a rational, secular foundation for ethics that we can sort of agree upon, that are established not because we've gotten it from a book somewhere, but because we are rational people that have agreed upon it.
Right. One of the privileges of being Western, certainly for the past couple of centuries, has been that the West has had an outsized kind of global power. And so we've been in a position to force our assumptions on the rest of the world. And because we do that, we are able to assume that what we believe isn't kind of bred of our culture, but is somehow universal. It's just the way it is. And so I would say that the idea that human rights are obvious, that they're universal, that they just exist, is precisely such an idea, because it's a completely theological concept, and it requires at least as much a leap of faith to believe in human rights as it does that Jesus rose from the dead and is seated at the right hand of the Father. Because the idea of human rights didn't just kind of emerge from nowhere. I mean, it's not a kind of universal. You don't get the idea of human rights appearing everywhere. It emerges in a very specific context, which again is this incredible revolutionary period that by and large we in the West have forgotten because it was successful in the 11th and 12th centuries. You know, it's the revolutions that don't entirely succeed that we remember. The ones that do succeed, we don't, because we internalize them. The church in the 11th century, you know, it's kind of willing itself to become sovereign, to emancipate itself from earthly kings, and to kind of establish a kind of concept, a framework of the universal that any Christian can appeal to over the heads of local lords, local kings, emperors, whoever. And to do that, there has to be a framework of law. And Christians, unlike the Jews or Muslims, don't have a great corpus of law that is written down. Paul said, you know, the law is written on the heart. That's where you have to look for it. But this kind of makes it problematic if you are, the churches, you're constructing a kind of sovereign state in which an ability to provide legal justice is fundamental to its purpose. You need to construct a body of law. And so by the 12th century, this is becoming evident. And so you start to get institutions emerging that emerge to solve basically precisely this problem. And these institutions come to be called universities. And the framework of law that people are trying to construct, you know, there's a hint in the word it's meant to be universal. And the lawyers who do this obviously look to Scripture more, above all. They also look to the canons that has been issued by the church over the centuries, so that's why they come to be known as canon lawyers. But they look above all to the Gospels. And in the Gospels, it's evident from Christ's teachings that the rich have a responsibility to the poor. That's the teachings of Dives and Lazarus. And the implication of that is one that these canon lawyers then start to tease out, because if the rich have a responsibility to care for the poor, then presumably the poor have a right to certain things that the rich can give them. The poor have a right to dignity, to shelter, to care, all these things. And over the course of the Middle Ages, canon lawyers construct this framework of law in which rights, the idea of rights, is absolutely embedded. So the idea that there's anything self-evident about this is a nonsense. And the truth is that it's absolutely rooted in theology, and it's absolutely rooted in faith. It's rooted in the conviction that what Christ is saying is true, that the rich do have a duty of care to the poor, and therefore the poor do have do have a hold on the rich. And I think that the great shadow that hangs over the kind of modern assumption that human rights are self-evident and that they're rooted in nature is of course Darwin, because although Darwin didn't actually use the phrase survival of the fittest, it was his cousin who coined that. And within a very short time after the publication of The Origin of Species, the idea that Darwinism could be summed up as survival of the fittest was going like wildfire. And that idea culminated in Nazism. And there's this... The Nazis looked at nature and said, this is all about the strong. The weak are a kind of drag. If we don't eliminate the weak, then we're doing what's wrong. The Nazis didn't, euthanize and practice genocide simply for the fun of being evil. They didn't think they were being evil. They thought they were doing the right thing. They thought that they were acting in obedience to the laws of nature. And what that says is that it's not at all, drawing lessons from nature, you can do anything you like. By and large, it will reflect your own image back at you. So, of course, liberals look at nature and say, oh, nature's liberal. Nature teaches us to be liberal. A Nazi will look at it and say, nature teaches us to, get rid of the weak, because it will kind of pull back the rest of the troop of apes as they prepare for war with the rival troop of apes. So if the Nazis had won the war, I'm sure that our conviction would be that nature teaches us to be fascist.
This is very interesting, and I have so many more questions and possible objections. But I think that the topic for tonight, like how did the Christian Revolution create our civilization, that we can say check, because we have at least gotten some idea about possible responses. So I thought we could actually leave the floor to you, and I should just mention that the quote that I read to you from this school book has been handled by Bjørn Are Davidsen in Lurt av læreboken. It's possible to purchase afterwards. And you can, of course, also purchase Dominion to get the full 600-page story that we're just briefly touching the surface on now. And perhaps it's even possible to get it signed by the author. What do you think? Do we have a volunteer that can walk around with the microphone? I know there's a microphone available, at least. Handheld microphone. Yeah? Can you confirm it, technician? Oh, great. Thank you. And we can start taking questions. And you can give questions in English or in Norwegian, if you're more comfortable with that, and the Spirit will provide interpretation. Or
I will speak in tongues.
I can, perhaps I can help if it's hard.
Hello. Yeah, thank you very much for a great talk, and thank you for the dinosaur talk earlier this day at the university. As a dino kid and also as a Christian, it was perfect synthesis. But I want to follow up with the question I asked you, in person, and that was if you could be accused of doing a sort of a re-enchantment project like Charles Taylor, for instance, with this secular age, and this is sort of a grand narrative. And then you said that non-verbatim, you said that you are actually you are disenchanting the secular instead of re-enchanting the world with the Christian mythos. As you said, as Taylor has also said in his secular age, that the atheistic, materialistic view of the world is also a myth. But then my question is, what now? If we are thrown out into a world in which we can choose to be Christian or Muslim, and if we choose to be atheists, then that is also a choice based on a sort of myth that we hold to be true. So my question is, in a post-secular age, to use the phrasing, what now?
Well, I think absolutely that that secular liberalism has its myths. I think we touched on human rights as an example. I think also, I do think the Nazis are absolutely fundamental to the ability of secular liberalism to sustain itself morally, because the Nazis serve us as the model of absolute evil, and I use that moral word very advisedly. And they serve us as the model of evil because the Nazis, unlike, say, the French revolutionaries or the Russian revolutionaries, which did target institutional Christianity and religion, but nevertheless in their conviction that the last shall be first, and their certainty that a time was coming when sheep and goats would be divided and a new Jerusalem would be built on earth, clearly are going with the grain of very, very important strains within Christianity. The Nazis didn't. The Nazis trampled on perhaps the two most shocking and fundamental ideas that Christianity bedded down. One of which was that that all human beings have an inherent dignity, and the other is that there is a kind of a moral quality in victimhood, in being weak, in suffering. And the Nazis obviously didn't believe that at all. They absolutely thought that there were differences between Jews and Greeks. And they absolutely thought that, that the weak and the feeble should be destroyed. And I think that one of the reasons for the collapse of institutional Christianity that began in the 60s is that, in a sense, as Europeans came to terms with the full horror of what the Nazis had done, and particularly the Holocaust, that provided a kind of more vivid mythology than Christianity could provide. So Hitler became the devil, the Nazis became demons, Auschwitz became hell. And the enduring power of that will be evident to anyone who has ever had an argument online with anyone. Because the law is that you will at some point be accused, certainly of being a fascist, and very probably Hitler at some point. And I think that is kind of a crucial part of the mythology that provides cement for the assumptions that liberals, and I speak as a liberal who basically has, I'm disenchanting my own beliefs. I'm kind of recognizing how contingent they are, how rooted in something that I hadn't realized they were rooted in. So what does the future hold? Well, I think either liberalism continues on its course, that it in a sense, its mythology is strong enough that it can cohere and will continue to structure Western society, or perhaps the horror of Nazism will start to fade, and people will start to say, well, actually, what's wrong with being strong? What's wrong with not caring for the weak or the poor? What's wrong with saying we don't want people who aren't like us in this country or whatever? I think that's another possibility, because if essentially the argument that every liberal has to those kind of points is to say, oh, you're a Nazi. But if people turn around and say, well, so what? Where do they go then? So that's a kind of difficult question. The third one is, I think, that there should be a process of re-enchantment, and that it's the responsibility of the churches to provide that. Because basically, Christianity is the seedbed. And if that seedbed is not being watered, if it's drying up, then what's going to happen to the blooms? And I don't know, I don't know the answer to that. But I think that one of the things certainly that's happened in England, and I'm pretty confident it's happened in Norway as well, perhaps even more in Norway and Scandinavia generally, is that the churches have massively lost confidence, because so much of what they provided has been absorbed by the state. And just as, in the Middle Ages, the Roman Church occupied the commanding heights, in the Reformation, Protestants did. So now it's secular liberals occupy the commanding heights. They're the ones who are writing the school books, for instance. I mean, that's a kind of classic example of who has the power. I think that rather than kind of kowtowing to that, rather than trying to kind of serve up, a liberalism with a cross on it, churches need to get back to kind of, celebrating the fact that what they're saying is just unbelievably odd and weird and bizarre. I mean, it's the kind of oddness that Paul felt. Because I think that too often, certainly in England and perhaps here as well, what spokesmen for the church serve up to people who are not Christians on the radio or TV or newspapers or whatever, and often even in churches themselves, is just a kind of reheated form of the liberalism that you get everywhere else. And I don't see the point of that. I mean, you've got to go into all this, it's absolutely mad. This guy got tortured to death, and then he rose up and went to heaven. And there's this every kind of mad stuff all going on, beginning, end, angels, bizarre. But I think, celebrate the bizarre and the weird and the strangeness of it, because otherwise what's the point of it? And I think that actually there's a kind of hunger for that.
We had a gentleman over here.
Okay, yeah?
Yeah.
Oh, there you go. Thank you, Tom. It was very nice of you to come here and lecture us. I was very happy it was you, Tom Holland, and not the actor portraying Spider-Man. That was
I've been waiting for
lecturing.
that.
Yeah.
I've been waiting for that.
We have the great cricketer and historian. That's very nice. Reading your book and maybe listening a bit to René Girard, for example, I get the idea, or I get at least the impression that I want to get, is that Christianity is very unique and maybe completely unique. And for me, that brings me great comfort, at least as a Christian. And it seems also from what you said here today that seems to be true. But is there any? Do you have any arguments against that? For example, that is my first question. That it's not unique. It's just a retelling, reliving of a previous myth or previous man-made god or something. And my second is more and more historically. It's regarding in your book you mention, among other things, how dramatic the Christianity's view on marriage, on marriage between a man and woman not longer being arranged, but a matter of free will, if you would like. Yeah, thank you.
Is Christianity unique? Well, nothing comes from nothing. Christianity, think of it as a kind of great lake being fed by different rivers. It's not a coincidence that Christianity emerges in the context of a would-be global empire, when for the first time the whole of the Mediterranean and much beyond has been brought under a single authority. And the conceit of the Romans is that their imperium is sine fine, without limit, universal. So that's a kind of crucial context. And it provides a space in which various traditions, of which the Jewish is obviously the most important, but also Greek, Persian, and indeed Roman, confuse and mix. And this is going on all the time. There are all kinds of different mystery cults. The cult of Augustus would be an example of it. It draws on all kinds of different elements. But Christianity is the most successful, and it's most successful because I think the configuration of it is unique. And I think that it radically reconfigures the way that, in the long run, vast numbers of people on the face of the planet end up thinking. And that's why even atheists and agnostics can't do anything about the dating system. In English it's BC, before Christ, and so it gets changed to BCE, before the Common Era. But that's just, you're still admitting the same thing. The Common Era is the era heralded by Christianity. And I think that there is a kind of further irony in this, because, talking about this idea of the secular and the religion, what Christianity has done, or rather what Christians have done, is reconfigure the rest of the world into Christian form. So Jews who up until the time of the French Revolution thought of themselves as a people, the people of Israel, were obliged to start thinking of themselves as belonging to a religion called Judaism. And now in Europe, and indeed beyond, Muslims who previously had thought of themselves as belonging to an ummah, that Islam was just, a bit like, it's just the way things are, Now they have freedom of religion in the West, but that requires them to think of themselves as belonging to a religion. So in a sense, the influence of Christianity on the world has been so profound that it's kind of reshaped and reconfigured other cultural frameworks to look like itself. And I think that may well be a further problem for Christianity. Because the kind of orthodoxy of multiculturalism is that, of course, you can all have, all religions are basically the same. Again, I don't know what the education system in Norway is like, but in England, my daughters went to a Church of England school, and they went to do RE, religious education, and there they were basically, they didn't study the Bible or anything like that. It was basically, what do Hindus think about smoking? Why is it, what's the similarities between a mosque and a Sikh temple or whatever? And basically the whole thing was basically all religions are the same. I mean, people who do it, they may have kind of different feast days and they may wear different clothes and things like that, but basically it's the same. And I think that is a real problem for Christians, and indeed for Muslims, because it serves to blur and diminish what makes these approaches to the world and the cosmos distinctive, because they just kind of end up as kind of comical regional variations. Sorry, there was another question which I've forgotten. Oh, marriage. Oh, goodness. Have we got time for marriage?
Give us the summary.
Are there other questions? I should probably...
Yeah, I think we can...
Unless you want me to talk about marriage.
Yeah, there's one here. Oh.
Thank you so much for coming tonight, and thank you, Filadelfiakirken, for organizing this event. I think it was very, very good. My question is, what can we learn from the first Christians? Because, as you said, and you did a very good description of the torture that they went through, but at the same time, they flourished. And it was also mentioned tonight that society is putting Christians out and out. And I think about my children and how can I, in a sense, guide them in the future? What can we learn from the first Christians that survived so much torture? And that's something that we might very closely go through in the future. Although I have to say, I do believe that the church will prevail, of course. But how can we manage that tightness?
I think a sense of the strangeness of it all. I think to try and see it afresh, to realize how strange it is, and in a sense how unsettling and maybe frightening it is. Because I think the early Christians themselves felt a sense of almost of kind of terror at the strangeness of what had been revealed to them. And I think that any sense that it's comfortable should be avoided. I mean, it can provide comfort, but it shouldn't be comfortable. Is there other?
Hello, there we go. Thank you for a very interesting conversation. I really appreciate the Dominion, and I've been talking to quite a few people about it. And some people are very skeptical about some of your claims. They may have read Richard Dawkins' Norwegian school books, others that claim that religion has mainly been had a bad influence on history. So they ask, why should they trust Tom Holland? And I want to tell them...
Well, why indeed?
Yeah, and I want to tell them, well, go check the historical sources yourself. But historical sources seem very inaccessible. So the question is there a way that non-historians can investigate the truth of historical claims? And if so, how?
Well, I mean, people can only trust me if they think that what I'm saying is, accurate or convincing. And of course, I mean, people are perfectly able to think it's all ridiculous. The argument that I'm making is one that draws on my understanding of what the historical evidence is. And so I can't imagine a variant of that argument that doesn't depend on looking at the historical evidence. There may be other ways to make it that maybe are theologically based or philosophically based. I don't know, because I'm not a theologian or a philosopher. But it does seem to me that when atheists like Richard Dawkins, for instance, say that religion is bad, as I've said, the word religion, for instance, you're immediately, that's a Christian category. And what do you mean by bad? Your understanding of what bad is, again, certainly in the context of Richard Dawkins, is a Christian one. And you can get a measure of that by comparing Richard Dawkins with, say, Friedrich Nietzsche, who, as an atheist, is infinitely more honest, and I think in many ways is the kind of probably the modern writer that Christians more than anyone else should read if they want a reassurance as to just how revolutionary their faith is. Because Nietzsche detested Christianity for its teachings. He detested the idea that the valorization of the victim. Richard Dawkins doesn't. Richard Dawkins, his values, his assumptions are all completely Christian. That's how I prove that I'm right and he's wrong.
Hello, thank you for a very interesting speech and also a very interesting book. I have one question related to also a fundamental Christian belief, and that is that a human being is a fallen man. And at least in my Christian tradition as a Catholic, that means that the human being is both good and evil. There is something good in man as such. And I was interested in knowing whether you as a historian, and you've been studying not only the Western culture, but I think more generally other cultures as well, at least prehistoric cultures related to Mesopotamia and Persia and so on. Have you made any thoughts about other cultures, to what extent the good, if it's true that man is also good, not only evil, has flourished in other cultures which has not been Christian cultures? And whether there is positive things to find from that, which would be very good for us, considering the weakness of Christianity in the West at the moment.
I think the great kind of influence on Christianity and indeed on Islam with this is it ultimately derives from Persia. And at the same time that Constantine is becoming a Christian, so in the Persian Empire, the Sasanian Empire, you're starting to get something that we would call Zoroastrianism, the idea that the world is divided into rival spheres of good and evil, of truth and falsehood, of light and darkness. And this sense is actually much older, and it goes back certainly to the time of the Persians who, for instance, fight the Battle of Marathon and Thermopylae and Salamis against the Greeks. And it's evident in Isaiah, I think, where Cyrus the Great, the first great Persian king, is actually hailed as the Messiah. And I think that what is, and it's one of the things that kind of got me interested in this whole subject, was realizing that the Persians were the first people really to moralize the idea of empire, to say that there are dimensions of good and evil, and obviously the Persians equated their empire with good, which in turn meant that anyone who didn't accept their empire was bad, an axis of evil, if you like. I think that the Christian understanding of it, certainly in the West, certainly in the Catholic tradition, and then into the Protestant tradition as well, is massively, massively influenced by Augustine again, who is this kind of titanic figure. And I think that his doctrine of original sin is so important. It's the first, I mean, his argument with it, it's the first example of a British intellectual being humiliated in an intellectual debate. So he's my kind of patron saint, really, Pelagius, who argued that it was possible for people to attain heaven under their own good graces, that it was possible to attain a kind of moral perfection. And Augustine said, no, we're all fallen. We all live in the city of man. Therefore, we all have sin. And this in the 60s, which I increasingly think is a decade as significant in the history of Christianity as the 1520s, which launched the Reformation. In the 60s, the doctrine of original sin was seen as absolutely monstrous. It was kind of one of the things that acted as one of the great ideological drags on Christianity. The idea that people were not born innocent. It was kind of fundamental to the whole idea of the hippie counterculture, that you could just wash away, people were naturally good. And I think that the result of that is that we now live in a Pelagian age. We live in an age where actually Pelagius has come back, because the idea that people can be good, can educate yourself, make yourself good, awake, become woke, become awakened, is certainly in America and Anglophone countries is a kind of idea that's absolutely sweeping cultural, intellectual life in America. And I think that the downside of it is that it risks a kind of terrifying degree of intolerance, because if you can make yourself perfect and you haven't made yourself perfect, then you should be condemned. Whereas actually I think certainly what I've come to realize, is that the doctrine of original sin is very, very democratic, because everybody's evil. Everybody has a taint of evil in them. And that means that none of us are perfect. And I think that it's that stops moralizing from becoming overly oppressive. Because if the saint, even the saint, is born with original sin, that stops them from assuming that they have the right to kind of lecture or bully you for being inadequate. Is my feeling. So even though he was British, I've come out against Pelagius.
Is this on? Yeah. Hi.
Yeah.
Thanks for a great talk. I have a bit historical question, but it is also a bit personal, so you have to decide if you want to, how much you want to answer. But early in the talk, you talked about the significance of the cross, and obviously you don't have any problem with acknowledging that this is a historical fact. And then you started to talk a bit about the resurrection. And if I quote you right, you said something like, that is the obvious explanation, the disciples' belief of a resurrected Jesus, which made the church explode. So I want to ask you, as an historian, what do you make out of the historical facts that the first Christians believed in a risen Christ?
I don't know. I'm fairly sure they believed that he'd risen from the dead. How and why they came to believe that, I don't know. And I can't answer that as a historian, because we don't know that. And it's a mystery that is comparable to why Muslims believed that the Quran was divine in its origins, which likewise they seem to have done right from the beginning. And I don't, there are kind of mystery. It's kind of like the kind of the heart of a great nuclear reactor. Historians cannot approach it. I don't know the answer to that. And trying to answer it would take one into a field, I think, beyond history.
He also knows N.T. Wright, so he's probably gotten the best possible presentation of the case for the resurrection. Yeah, perhaps you choose, so I'm not to blame.
Yeah, thank you for. I really agree with you with the origins of the concept of human rights, but still I wonder, and maybe I'm moving from the descriptive to the normative here, but what then should we use as a common framework for international politics, for international relations? Because it could be interpreted very relativistically. That the human rights are just a Christian concept, a theological concept. So what should we use? What should we do about that? Do we need it as a myth, and in that case, is it dangerous to kind of reveal it as a myth?
That is the huge question, and that's why I kind of think maybe it's a bit dangerous to pursue this, because the truth is that the framework of international law emerged in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars as a conscious attempt by the Protestant and Catholic powers to create a framework of law that both of them could accept. And the immediate context was the drive by the British to abolish the slave trade. And the problem was that the inspiration for abolitionism was a very specifically radical form of Protestantism. Essentially, the belief that you could read the Bible and the Spirit would enable you to interpret it in a way that was true to God's purposes, which is why it didn't matter that there was no prohibition against slavery as an institution in the Bible. Protestants in the Atlantic world could read it and just know, because the Spirit had possessed them, had taken hold of them, that God wanted slavery abolished. And it was this that led Lord Castlereagh, the Foreign Secretary at the Congress of Vienna, to have to push it, because it was, there was this great mass movement going on. But he had to persuade the Catholic powers, because it was the Spanish and the Portuguese and the French as well who were now going to be doing the slaving. So what the lawyers at the Congress of Vienna and then afterwards did was to fuse the tradition of human rights that came from the Catholic tradition with the kind of idea that I just know slavery is wrong because I feel it in my heart, tradition of Protestantism, which effectively served to create a framework of international law that everyone could accept. And then what happened over the course of the 19th century is that when the European powers started to enforce this idea that slavery should be abolished on other powers, they did so in the name of an international law that supposedly stood over and above, say, Islamic law. And this was essentially an expression of European strength over Ottoman weakness. And the more powerful that European and then American power became, the more they were, lawyers from European and American countries were able to impose this. And in a sense, the Charter of the United Nations is the kind of ultimate expression of that. And I think that you can see that as Western power retreats, so its ability to pretend that the framework of international law is not an expression of the West's period as the global hegemon becomes more and more obvious. And I think that's a huge part of what is going on with the rise of China. And it's why people in the West find it so unsettling. And the truth is the Chinese are right when they say that all of this is, culturally Western. It is. But obviously, the problem for
for liberals in the West is that if that's the case, on what basis do you say it's true? It's not a problem for Christians. Because a Christian can say it's true because it happened. Christianity's true. What does a liberal do? A liberal say liberalism's true. I mean, it's a huge problem. And possibly an opportunity for Christians, actually.
I think we have time for one last question.
Gentleman there with the beard and the... I hope it's not a terrible question now.
Thank you. I would think that your message must be massively uncomfortable for the average liberal in the liberal society today. So you must have had interesting criticism. You must have met interesting arguments against. And I was also thinking how to communicate this to sort of to beginners, to non-Christians. You know, oh, here's this 600-page intellectual book in English.
Very cheap.
You know, yeah, very cheap. You know, so have you considered making sort of a lighter introduction book, a beginner's book, a kind of Dominion for Dummies?
Yes, I mean, there has been kind of kickback, but to be honest, I wrote a book about the origins of Islam in which I questioned whether Mecca was where Muslims thought Mecca was and where the Quran had come from and what we knew about Muhammad. And the blowback from that was so terrifying that, you know, a few liberals being cross is very, you know, I didn't, I don't care. I don't see that I'm not doing it as a proselytizer. You know, I don't feel I have a sense of mission. It's the conclusion that I've come to, you know, doing what I do, which is writing books of history that are designed to be accessible to the general reader. I would say, on top of that, if I may advertise, that I discuss this theme quite a lot on a podcast I do. I think did you mention it? I'm losing all track of
the
what
podcast.
You've been saying. The podcast you did, didn't you? The Rest is History.
Yeah.
Yeah. So on The Rest is History, available from all platforms. Do download. I do talk about this quite a lot, and maybe the best way is just to recommend all your friends to listen to that. I chose wisely in picking you out, sir. Thank you very much.
I think your co-host, Dominic Sandbrick, almost made a drinking game out of your podcast.
Did,
that each time you drag Christianity into some obscure topic, then...
Yeah, it is a running joke.
Yeah. Well, I think what we'll learn today is that the next time you see a Me Too movement, or a BLM riot, or a secular humanist, or an atheist talking to you how the science and reason is about salvation, then you can start thinking about them as Protestants.
And Catholics, if they're talking about human rights.
Yeah. So last, we just want to thank all of you so much for coming. We want to thank Filadelfiakirken so much for partnering with us in Lage to create this kind of arenas for, to talk about society and culture, hopefully in a constructive way. There will be another opportunity tomorrow because there will be a breakfast meeting at MF at 9:15, which is open. You can register online and attend that. There will be Tom Holland in a conversation with Henrik Syse. So I think that will be very interesting. So all of you Tom Holland groupies can just follow him. I think that's it. So let's give a hand for Tom Holland.
Thank you.
And his book is available downstairs.